Hey, welcome back to Storytime with me. Still on Headhunters of the Amazon. We're up to chapter 11, Iquitos, which I totally thought I did already, but the battery died about 3/4 of the way through that recording. I thought I was onto a pretty good recording there too. It's telling stories I kind of, it's been a little wishy-washy the last few things. He's like, I don't know, he's just been whinging in the jungle. It's not been all that fun. But this getting to the bits where he's back into the civilization and he's running into all these characters, and it's starting to get interesting again. So I don't know, maybe I'll put it out on a blooper reel or something, but yeah, I was quite enjoying my last version of this, so hopefully I managed to do this alright. So this is probably going to be my last video from Ireland. I know, right? It's been 5 months here. It was supposed to be longer, but what's it now? It's Tuesday now. I fly out back to New Zealand on Thursday. I get there on Friday, and then I have another week, and I'll move from Christchurch down to Dunedin, and then I shall officially be getting settled. But which is really exciting. I'm really looking forward to doing story time at home. But I suppose with real people like sitting there and listening, and rolling up for me, and story time. But what was I saying? I got all excited there. But yeah, I think I'm gonna have to keep this book for the videos for Rog, and I don't know who the fuck else isn't in New Zealand. Well, Birdie's gonna be up in Christchurch while I'm down south, so for all you lads that aren't cool enough to be in Dunedin where I'm gonna be living. It's been just too long coming. Anyway, so that's a whole bunch of babble. This is probably how I ran out of battery for the last one of this that I recorded. So on you lads. I have been doing the epic packing missions. I don't know if you can see that, but look, the walls are nearly naked. Floor is that visible. Doing the mad packing missions. So not my most flattering view. Oh wow. Where are we? Chapter 11, Iquitos. Catch my breath. Iquitos sprang from the necessity for a receiving and distributing centre for rubber and merchandise, respectively for the upper Amazon system, corresponding to Manaus and Pará for the lower. It was composed, for all practical purposes, like so many riverside towns, of one long street with its one-storey adobe mud houses with corrugated iron roofs, how unromantic, in which were to be found the offices and warehouses of the local branches of American and European houses. For the rest, a number of miserable, unmade side streets where lived the native population of Cocama Indians, canoemen and rubber workers, and Peruvian cocheros. The houses in these back streets were built of bamboo, with thatched roofs. The walls were transparent in places, their only virtues being their cleanliness and cheapness. Telegraphs, telephones, sewers, electric light, ice plants, and pavements were refinements of civilization which had not yet penetrated to Iquitos. Water was carried from the river in earthenware jars by the native servants. The town sprang up like a boom town in the west, doomed to exist only as long as the commercial possibilities of which it was born should last. When I was there, the population must have numbered 10,000. Later, it grew to be half as big again. Today, it is the home of a handful of Indians. The town is 15 days in a twin-screw steamer from Pará, some 3,000 miles. It's situated near the junction of several big tributary rivers by which the rubber used to be brought down to the mainstream from the camps, its site marking the limit of practical navigation for ocean-going steamers all the year round. In the year 1900, Captain Todd of the gunboat Wilmington, U.S. Navy, stated in his official report of his cruise up the Amazon that the average depth in the rainy season from Iquitos to the sea was 120 feet. With our 2 canoes lashed together so as to form a raft, we paddled into Iquitos at midnight on the 27th of December, 1898, after wending our way through a network of backwaters from San Juan, a village at the mouth of the Napo where we picked up a couple of Indian guides. And this is one of those bits where I pause to go, I'm sorry These names are not in a language I speak. I apologize for the butchering. And it is, I'm going to say, this letter is just a horribly written piece of writing. My cranky face. Even as we were covering those last few miles, Messrs. P. Morai y No of Pará were writing to my home in Almeida, one of the many letters written from various places between Guayaquil and Pará during my years of wandering in the wilderness, which attempted to put my family on my track. Here is what they wrote. Pará, December 24th, 1898. Madame, your favour of the 31st October is in our hands, and we regret not being able to give you any further news of your son, who is 3,000 miles away from this city, but he will surely receive any letters you send him to the care of Mr. Elias Andrade. For more safety, you might put your letter under a second cover, addressed to Messrs. Marius and Levi in Iquitos, Peru, via Pará, Brazil. They are in Iquitos, the agents of Mr. Andrade, who lives on the river Napo. We are, madam, yours respectfully, P. Morai y No. Although we were unshod, unhatted, and unshorn, we felt that we had climbed the social ladder at least one rung when we cast aside our red calico dungarees in favour of the more usual attire supplied us by Morse, the engineer on D. Philippe Moret's steamer. So we were not ashamed to call on the first rubber merchants we happened to come across and dispose of our cargo. Having frustrated these gentlemen's attempt to short-weight us, we brought a cart round to carry our money away. It weighed 120 pounds. There was no paper money in Iquitos. It was the custom to go shopping with a wheelbarrow. There was a German-American barber who had established himself in that god-forsaken town, the El Dorado of the Upper Amazon, for reasons best known to himself. The sight of a pair of bewhiskered tramps walking down the street, citizens of his adopted country, excited him to make us an offer of a free haircut. We, who had just sold a ton of rubber and were wondering what we could do with so much money. We had our 2-year-old beards and flowing locks trimmed, however, and turned our attention to the boot shops, but bootless we were destined to remain. For Jack failed to find a pair that were big enough for him in the whole town, and I, if I had persisted in the effort to accustom myself to having my feet enclosed in leather after so long a period of freedom, should have reduced them to a state of complete unservableness. Hear, hear. And so we found our way to an hotel, the Hotel Roma, and feeling like a pair of lost souls being admitted into the gates of paradise, we were shown a room with beds in it. Beds. After 2 years of sand, mud, trees, and at best palm leaves to sleep on, beds were something of a novelty. I have no doubt that they were in reality exceedingly inferior beds, but they, at any rate, possessed all the outstanding features common to the species. Next day, I wrote home for the 3rd time since leaving Quito. Such opportunities were rarities in that country. The letter, unlike its predecessors, duly arrived about 2 months later. We soon changed our quarters and, although we continued to eat at the hotel, went to bunk with Dr. X. Having taken the last bit of advice that Morse hurled at us over the steamboat's taffrail. Dr. X was an enthusiastic American, to say the least of it. Nobody dared open his mouth in his presence with any reference to things American. There was no knowing what the result might be. The doctor made Vesuvius look like an iceberg. From him we gleaned some interesting information. Round the walls of his smoking room were hung pictures of war. Attracted by their startling appearance, we were moved to ask him about them, with the result that we learned that the Spanish-American War had been declared, fought, and won. The discovery came as a great shock and a keen disappointment, for, had we been in touch with civilization, our history might have been very different. Even Andrade had made no mention of the outstanding event of the years 1897 to 8. During our stay with the doctor, we had some amusing times. Iquitos contained so much human driftwood that there was ever some new freak to be met, with a strange tale to tell and a still stranger outlook on life. Our host himself was no exception. Having reached Iquitos, goodness knows how, and the devil only knows whence, on a patent medicine-selling tour, he decided that, as far as Iquitos was concerned, patent medicines wouldn't go down, that it was a mighty easy thing to pull out other people's teeth. So he set to work and manufactured a range of diplomas and certificates, bearing witness to his proven skill as a dentist, decorated his house with them, and invited the public to try their luck. This was all divulged to us once in a moment of semi-consciousness during which he thought himself about to die. His friend and associate was a certain Dr. Y. The latter might possibly, by a stretch of the imagination, have been a brakeman on a freight train, but was certainly never anything more before he struck Iquitos. That place must have some magical, mysterious power of working on men's imaginations, for Y, if his name was such, no sooner arrived than he put up a brass plate on his door and started to work up a practice. He used to come to Dr. X to hold consultations about the difficult cases. Their diagnoses would, if recorded, form an interesting study. I remember one particularly serious case. There was a wretched individual who had been on the point of death for days, and these two could make nothing of the case. Finally, the patient, worn out by fever and the attentions of the doctors, went to a better land. X drew Y aside and discussed the question of the certificate that had to be issued. "Look here," he said. "We'll put down that he died owing to a congestion of the alimentary canal between the gallbladder and the lungs, causing the cold bile to rise and cake round the heart." And it was so. Evidently, the prospect of losing further important patients, and thereby running the risk of his professional skill being impeached by the ignorant masses, caused him to give up his fine practice, for he shortly took down his brass plate and accepted an invitation to become engineer on a 12 horsepower steam-propelled scow, and flat-bottomed at that, plying between Iquitos and an adjacent Seringal, more or less on the dividing line between the Seringa and Cauchac territory. Here he was no more at home, for he had more spare time for spinning the yarns for which he was famous. Here he was no doubt more at home, for he had more spare time for spinning the yarns for which he was famous. I remember one particularly lurid tale of his. He had been up some stream in a canoe, and on the return journey he was alone. Suddenly, he found himself in a zone which was so full of tigres, the Amazonian name for jaguars, that he was pursued by an unending chain of them on both banks, the smallest of them 10 feet long, all roaring and baring their fangs at him, so that it was impossible to land for 3 days and 3 nights. And it was commonly thought that he must have shipped a case of scotch in that canoe of his, if he ever went at all. The last chapter in our acquaintance with him was dramatic to a degree. On one of his trips downstream, with that American-owned 12 HP stern wheeler of which he was in charge, he carried his crew of 2 cucamas and his boatload of rubber past Iquitos, having decided to face the world again. He didn't stop till he reached Manaus, where he sold up the rubber for cash, obtained a cargo of trade goods on the credit system, and pushed off downstream again. That was where his luck held out, because if anybody interested in the deal had seen him starting downstream with the trade goods, they might have asked some awkward questions. Arrived at Pará, he sold the steamer plus the trade goods and promptly disappeared. The American owners arrived shortly afterwards in Iquitos and were forced to the conclusion that those famous jaguars must have prevented Captain Tom, he'd dropped doctor and adopted captain by then, from landing at any point in the 3,000 odd miles between their plantation and the sea. But if Iquitos was not rich in doctors, there were at any rate plenty of mosquitoes, not so much in the town itself, which is built on a high bank and thus exposed to wind and sun, as in the surrounding swamps and forests. They might be compared with a Scotch mist or a London fog, without straining the metaphor. They formed dense clouds everywhere, and the air hummed with the tiny trumpeting of millions of these, the cruelest pets of the Amazon. It was impossible to keep domestic pets, for their lives would have been a misery. A turkey buzzard, part of every tropical landscape, sitting on the gable end of a house on the outskirts of the town, could only be seen through a haze of mosquitoes. There are places in the vicinity of Iquitos where the clouds of these insects are so dense that it is said the most practical way of judging the time of day by the sun is to throw a stone into the air and observe the angle at which the sun's rays fall through the hole thus made in the mosquito cloud. Ooh. And so time went on, while Jack and I awaited Morse's return before booking a passage to New York. The ocean-going steamers, principally the Booth Line, tied up every fortnight direct from Liverpool, their arrivals constituting the chief event of the town's life. There were a good many other boats in those days, tramp steamers that called in to try and pick up a freight of rubber, which, together with the ocean-going vessels, formed the only means of communication with the outer world. Excuse. There was also a regular line of river steamers between Iquitos and Pará, and a cable between Pará and Manaus, which was, however, nearly always broken down. One day, a riverboat from Manaus arrived. It brought with it William Game, an Irishman of good family. He'd settled in the Argentine some years before. Blue-eyed, ruddy-cheeked, big-limbed, strong as an ox, he was always ready for a fight or a frolic. Absolutely fearless, he put his faith in his right hand. None of us knew what possessed him to come up to Iquitos of all places. Certain it is that he had to leave the Argentine on account of a difference with the governor of Punta Arenas, the coaling station at the Pacific end of the Straits of Magellan. Punta Arenas was reputed to be the toughest town on the face of the earth, so Game found himself at home in Iquitos, where no questions were asked. In the absence of a police force, every man was taken on his face value and carved out his own career. We ran into Game the first day he was ashore, just about the same time as our new friend Morse returned from his upriver trip, having handed over to her owners the boat whose engines he'd been testing. Edward Morse, of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, had, curiously enough, arrived in Iquitos in much the same way as I had. Moved by what impulse I do not know, he shipped aboard a tramp steamer in New York which is bound for the Pacific coast of South America, via the Straits of Magellan. In the Straits, the ship was wrecked, but the crew and the passenger, Morse, escaped with their lives by abandoning the cargo and so floating the boat. They put in at some Peruvian port for repairs, where Morse left the ship and gradually worked his way up to Cuzco, the old Inca capital of King Atahualpa. There, he met a fellow of the name of Kirby, a well-known traveller in South America. Together, they decided to attempt much the same kind of journey as Jack Rouse and I undertook. Their route across the continent lay down the Madre de Dios, the Beni and the Madeira, and so into the Amazon from the south side. Not far as distance go in that country from Manaus. After many adventures, including the loss of their canoe and everything they possessed except the clothes they wore, they were picked up off a raft by a cochero who was going up the Madeira to establish a rubber camp. Arrived at the mouth of that river, the two parted, Morse taking a steamer up to Iquitos, and Kirby going on his way to New York. Morse had been in Iquitos for a few days when an opportunity occurred for him to make some money. He was a mechanical engineer by profession. Don Louis Philippe Mouret, having just received a steel steamboat in sections, was looking for a man to put it together for him when he met my friend, whom he engaged to do the work and carry out the necessary tests. It was while out on the trial trip that he was accosted by Jack and myself on the lower reaches of the Napo. The similarity of our temperaments, and the taste for adventure which we shared, drew Morse and myself together from our first meeting. Before we had been together very long, I discovered that he was moved by the same spirit which impelled Cecil Rhodes. He was, like the great English empire builder, obsessed by the possibilities of the vast virgin territory which was calling for men to develop its unlimited resources. Schemes for hewing down the forests, clearing great tracts of rich soil, building roads and railways, planting, mining, ranching. One after another they passed through his brain. He used to write the most wonderful descriptions of the country and what could be done with it to all the rich men he could think of, in an endeavour to raise enough money to start its conquest. And after all, as it turned out, there was a great deal in what we used to ridicule. And finally there was Ambusha. In the Jivaro dialect, Ambusha means a bird which sings at night. He earned the name by his habit of incessantly grinding his teeth while asleep. It was given him by the Indians, an astonishingly happily simile for so simple a people to strike. He called himself Charles Pope, stated that he was an American citizen of Austrian birth, spoke French, English, and half a dozen languages that sounded like nutmeg grater, and had an enormous appreciation of his own achievements. It was this latter side of his character that was so dangerous, as we afterwards learned, for he believed so implicitly in his own prowess in woodcraft, cooking, and other campaigning accomplishments that he frequently led us into dilemmas, both geographical and gastric, from which we escaped only by exercising the greatest care. Now, the close association of four such characters as Rouse, Game, Morse, and myself in such an environment as Iquitos was bound to end in something startling. Having written home and made my peace with my family, the idea of returning to city life gradually faded before the infinitely more attractive prospect of some get-rich-quick adventure in the wilds of the Amazon, an idea which was fanned into greater activity by the influence of my companions. We had all drifted together more and more as the days went by, and little by little it became a recognized fact that we would promote an expedition up into the unknown territory on the headwaters of the parent streams of the Amazon. I had already forgotten the horrors of fever under the influence of quinine, of which I began to take enormous doses the moment I arrived in Iquitos. 100 grains a day for a week or 10 days put me right, and I've never had a serious return of the trouble since. A little good food, too, drove from my mind the memories of the dead hog, the turkey buzzard, the anteater, and all the lean months through which Jack and I had existed. Then somebody mentioned Inca gold. That was the spark which fired the fuse. Under the influence of Jack's rhetoric, the final decision was made. We would go and find the source from which the old lords of South America, whose jewel kingdom overlooked the valleys which we were to explore, drew their wealth. Jack's theory sounded plausible enough to our ready ears. He argued that as the Andes and the Pacific coast had been civilized and prospected for 100 years, and no gold quartz mines had ever been found, the only other source from which the ancient Incas could have obtained their metal was placer mines, where the mineral is found among the surface soil, and the unexplored headwaters of the vast system of waterways which originates in the eastern footholds of the Ecuadorian and Peruvian Andes. As a matter of fact, for many years, past expeditions have frequently started out for the Andes on the same quest from Buenos Aires and other centers in the belief that there exists somewhere a vast hoard of wealth. This expedition of ours having become the talk of our town, and its fame having reached the ears of Ambusha as he lived on Yamanchi in a dugout on the waterfront, he came to me with his proposition. He had lived in this condition since his arrival from some unknown part of the Amazon network, where he had doubtless practiced some of his arts all too successfully, and had had to decamp hurriedly in consequences. Of the Trotsky rather than the Hindenburg type, he was a blue-eyed, sandy individual, big-boned and of average height. His manner was oily. He stood with his hat in his hand, and his eyes, feet, and statements were shifty. He was obviously a liar, but appeared to be a muscular liar. His subsequent conversation showed him to be a devout student of anarchism, toxicology, and circumlocution, as well as of languages. He was of the type which prefers to see its enemies pass away quietly, rather than to run the risk of shooting them. He was given to rhetorical outbursts, in common with his misguided kind, which invariably ended with the supposedly unanswerable question, "What right have you to make laws to govern me?" But, as I have said, he was at any rate muscular. So when he presented himself to me with a suggestion that he should accompany the expedition as cook, that he didn't expect any return for his services, except his keep, and that, if we found gold, we would give him what we liked for his trouble, it seemed to me to be a fair proposition, in view of his alleged skill with the paddle and frying pan. I engaged him on the spot, and moved him from his lair to the hotel. We kept him there for a fortnight to his intense surprise and joy. But in the meantime, much had happened in Iquitos.